Thank you, Barry. I think if my wife was in the room with me, she'd say I'm quite large enough. Thank you very much, and perhaps I ought to be made smaller. Leaving that aside, thanks very much. I'm going back really 6 months because I think I gave a presentation 6 months ago to the East Midlands meeting, and I went back and looked at my slides, and I thought, well, some of those are still valid, and we can build on that. So I've refreshed what I said 6 months ago, but nobody can probably remember what I said 6 months ago anyway. So let's go for it. And I can really only talk about my experience at London Road in Newark, and I don't hold us up as a paragon of all the virtues, but I can tell you what we've been up to, and perhaps a little bit about why. And obviously, if you've got any questions, I'm quite happy to listen to answer those later on. So I want to start with a couple of diagrams, and some people have seen these before, some people won't, but I really like these diagrams, and it's not just because they're in pretty colours. But what I'm trying to do in the first diagram is explain how I think our church in particular, I'm not saying any other church, how I think our church saw things a few years ago. And it's up until probably two years ago, the Sunday worship thing was dominant. That's what made the church, and all the other bits around the edges, the interesting things we were doing in all sorts of areas, weren't really anything to do with it. They were just hanging on the edge of the Sunday worship. And if the Sunday worship was going well, i.e. there were lots of people coming, we were doing well. And if Sunday worship was going badly and not many were turning up, the church was failing. And I wanted us to get away from that way of thinking, because I think that the more accurate way of looking at things is like this. So I think we'd all agree that Jesus Christ needs to be in the centre. And the way I see Sunday worship is that it's one of the things the church does to try and point people in the direction of Jesus. And it's not the only thing the church does do that. I think it's really important that that's understood before we move on to anything else, because it has a bearing on other things I'm going to talk about. So if you hear nothing else from me today, and you ignore everything I say, which I wouldn't blame you for in the least, this is the message that I want to say is really important. Church isn't just Sunday worship, and we fall into the trap time and time again in thinking that it is. We talk about how we're going to do church, and we're thinking about Sunday worship. And I don't agree with the starting point of that premise at all. Sunday worship's interesting, and it's important, and it matters, but it shouldn't predominate discussion about what church is, because there are lots of other things that churches do. And I'm not going to talk in detail about the things that we do at our church, but that point of principle really matters to me, and therefore it has a bearing on other things. So I want to just quickly go through next how things were during lockdown. And these are some of the activities that we did that were on the earlier slides. So during the lockdown, everything we could do online went online. We stopped meeting physically at all because we weren't allowed to for quite a long time. So Sunday worship was online, so was the film club, the Bible book club, the Bible study, and the community choir as well made an attempt to operate online. But other things just stopped. So things where you needed to be physically present to enable it to happen. And the two things I've picked out here are my pub theology sessions, because you can't do pub theology unless you're in a pub by definition. And the parent and toddler group, of course, just stopped happening. So that's where we were. And now I want us to look briefly at how things are now. And again, it's important to recognise that all these things are church. The one that we'll come to at the bottom, Sunday worship, is church, but it's not the only thing that is church. So we've got a very hybrid situation now. Some things are happening again back in the buildings that previously were in the buildings because they physically need people to manifest themselves. So the choir are meeting in the church hall at the minute. I should be singing bass with the choir if I wasn't in this meeting, but they're probably quite grateful I'm not. The parent and toddler group meet in the church hall, and the pub theology group, well, the pub's back open again, so we can meet again, and we started meeting the pub theology back in the building. To all intents and purposes, those things are back to where we were 18 months ago. But there are other things that aren't. So the film club and the Bible book club and the Bible study sessions, are meeting online. They could, some of them, potentially meet physically, but there are a couple of very good reasons why they can't and why it doesn't make sense to. And one is that they've been expanding so successfully that we haven't got the space to put people in a room anymore. So the film club always met in mine and Deborah's home. And up until lockdown, we probably had about 12 people on the roster. And if everybody turned up, we could just about squeeze them into our house. And now I think we're now up to 20 people. We've grown by over 50% during the lockdown. And the reason why these are online is because you can't physically get the people in the rooms and the venues we used to use. It's the same with the Bible Book Club. We met in somebody else's home for that, and the home couldn't take it. And there are people who are joining in these activities now who are distant and remote from Newark. And some people could travel to Newark for these sorts of activities, but it would require them to travel 12, 15, 20 miles. And it works perfectly well online. And these things are going to stay online because they work well, very well there, and we can't find another way of doing it. So the other thing that we will come on to then, and it's last on the list, is the Sunday worship. What are we doing with that? Well, we found that the online worship on Zoom worked really well for a year. It really did. We had a very good community feeling of the people there. We had people joining us from various places. Elaine from Narborough joined us on occasions. We've had the people from the old Nottingham Church join in to our worship online and subsequently become members of the church. We've had people from all over the place, and it made a really good community feel. And when we were doing that, we were always aware that there would be a requirement, a pressure to get back into the building when we could. And that happened back in August. We reopened the building, but we made this commitment to people who were joining us online, which was, there is no way we are going to leave you out of our considerations for the future. Those people made a huge impact on our church. The church has developed in depth and in breadth over that period of time, and there was no way we were going to come back into the building and leave our new friends who had joined us through another way in the lurch and say, well, sorry, it was nice having you for a year. Off you go. We're going back to where we were. It was never going to happen. We made a commitment that would never happen, and we've invested in making sure it didn't happen, and it is now happening as a hybrid operation. So what I mean by that is there are people who come into the building and to all intents and purposes that things are much the same as they were for those people, but a big difference is at the front of the church now, in front of the pulpit, there is a big screen and a projector showing the people who aren't in the building. So the people who aren't in the building are also being in front of the people who are in the building, and they can participate in discussions, and they can contribute, and they can do readings, they can see and hear what's going on, just the same as the people can in church. It's a bit Heath Robinson in its effect at the minute. If you looked in our church, there are a lot of cables trailing around the place, and it's not how we want it to be in the fullness of time. We want it to be all hardwired in and to get the technology right, but it works well enough to allow that to happen, and I think that's really, really important. And some people are choosing to not come into the building for various reasons, maybe because they don't want to travel, maybe because it's more convenient for them not to have to disrupt their Sunday morning by as much as it would be if they were traveling into the building. Maybe because they've still got some concerns about the virus and they don't want to be in the same physical place as people. But we've made that offer and we've kept to that offer, and it is working quite well for us. So that's where we're at. And Barry did pose some questions at the beginning, and when he sent out a message to myself and to Jim saying he'd like us to talk about this, he posed, I think, 4 questions to us about what are the ecclesiological implications of doing church in a hybrid way, such as I'm doing, and I think Jim is doing too. So these were Barry's questions. And I just want to address each one of those in turn. And obviously on these questions, this is my opinion, and you feel free to differ in your opinion from me. But I'll give you my points of view on these things. So is it possible to be a covenanted online church? Well, I really can't see why not. Obviously, until really very recently, churches were locally based and physically located because there wasn't really another option. Up until 2 years ago, I don't think many churches had thought about the fact of doing things online, although the facility might well have been there. Churches had always been physically located in a community, and that was where the church met, and that's what happened. It was the only way it could happen. But the technology now that we've become aware of has enabled us to think about other ways of being and doing church. Obviously, if you want to go back to a biblical mandate, well, you won't find one for an online church, will you? How could you find a biblical mandate for an online church? But I'm firmly of the view that we need to adapt our ecclesiology to modern circumstances, and above all, resist the urge for the comfort blanket of the good old days. It was always like this, therefore it's always got to be like this. We're no longer living in the 1950s. So I can't see a reason at all why you can't be a covenanted online church. Do we need to distinguish those who can't meet face to face as adherents only? And I'm vehement on this one. I'm absolutely certain of my answer on this one, because it's absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because for the last 12 months, everybody who's been meeting in our church has been meeting online. And there's no way we were going to say to those people who are meeting online over the last 12 months, actually, you can't be members for the time being because you're only meeting online. So why should it be any different from the people who are only meeting online now? It doesn't make any sense. There are always going to be some things that online people can't do. But there are also going to be things that people who are offline can't do as well. And let's use an example. So there are going to be things that people can't do physically in the church building because they're online. But there are also things that people who aren't online can't do. And if you use the wider definition of church to include things like the film club and the Bible book club, the people who aren't online can't join in with those at the minute because they're only online. It swings and roundabouts. It would be ideal if everybody could take the option to do both, but they can't. And therefore, there are going to be advantages in some ways of delivering things for some people and disadvantages for other people. And I think that you've just got to take that as it is. But there is no way that I would even consider telling some of my new members at our church that they can't be members because they can't physically come to the building. It's not going to happen. So I think I made myself clear enough. Online communion. I haven't got a problem with this either. For some churches, I can see where this would be a problem. For a Roman Catholic, I think this is a huge problem. And that's because of their understanding of what the communion actually is. But to me, and I think to most Congregationalists, communion is a symbolic act. There's no magic that happens to the bread and the wine to change it into something else. There's no suggestion, is there, that the very first communion involved anything other than ordinary bread and ordinary wine. And by the way, in passing, the wine wouldn't have been alcohol-free either, would it? But provided that those who are participating in the communion do it in the right spirit, I can see no reason at all to challenge the validity of an online act of symbolic remembrance with their own bread and their own wine that are just as ordinary as the ones in the building. And the final one was, how valid is an online church meeting? And I put the question back, well, how valid is an online area assembly meeting? It's the same thing, isn't it? Rob spoke very well about the fact that the Holy Spirit was present with us during our deliberations earlier. I'm absolutely certain he's right. And I can see no reason whatever to think that he's not, that the Holy Spirit's not with us as we gather virtually online to have a virtual church meeting either. We're not physically gathered, but we are gathered. And we're gathered in a way that couldn't have been conceived of 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, 20 years ago, but can be now. And therefore, there's no reason why it can't happen. So there are my answers to those 4 questions. I'm quite happy to take any questions or listen to any points anyone wants to make, but that's my contribution for this morning.
I can explain how we combine text and picture if anyone wants to know, but if you don't want to know, that's fine. So for us in Yelvertoft, after lockdown, as Mark suggested, we're running Sunday services hybrid. So we're continuing to join on Zoom. I'm not sure that I would anyway, we're continuing to use Zoom in a hybrid fashion, and the reality is that some of our people are not ready to rejoin in the building yet, and so for different reasons people are not yet ready to come to a gathering, and that in the meantime, during lockdown, one of our people is in a care home who wasn't in a care home. One has become housebound, and other new people have joined from a distance. So we do the services on Zoom, we record them and put the recordings on YouTube, and we have several people who don't want to join on Zoom who choose to watch the recordings. They don't want to make themselves known in church, but they watch the recordings regularly. So that's interesting. I think before lockdown, our typical congregation was around about 10. And probably our typical congregation is sort of 20 to 25 at the moment, including the people online. So there's a difference there. So we're not huge. We're a small village church. Moved to a situation before lockdown where our services were very informal. We tended to sit in a circle, and often we would choose the hymns as we went, and we would it was very interactive, more like a small group, which is fine and is good for a group of up to sort of 10 people. We really can't make that work on Zoom, and we've had to become a much more sort of front-led, formal offering, but that's probably only the same as most other people are doing anyway. So we have a camera that's pointing at the space behind the lectern, and the person speaking can. So we've had to become more structured than we were previously. But if we had 25 people in the building rather than 10 people in the building, we'd have probably become more structured than we are now. I have to say that isn't universally popular. So some of the people coming to the building are frustrated that we can't take the service back to where it was before Zoom and before going online. But we're clear when we talk about it together, and we had a good discussion about it at our church meeting last Monday, that we have to cater for those people who are in the building and the people who are online, and that what happens has to, we have to make the changes, and people will have to accept that there are things that are different. Like Mark, we have collections of cables running around the building, and one thing and another. So, that's the reality. That presents a big challenge for me, I have to say, because I'm very much the sort of technical lead as well as the person leading the services and so on. And I've only missed one service, I think, since the start of lockdown. I've been there every other week, and that's kind of a challenge that we have to get over. But I'm very blessed that tomorrow I'm going to be training a girl just turning 16 in the technology side of things, and she's ready to come and help with that. So that's a real answer to prayer, because we really need some things to be less dependent on me. Or Jan can handle things, but on Jan and I being there, we tend to want to be away at the same time for strange reasons. So that's kind of where we're at. Interestingly, the various groups that use our building during the week have come back with more enthusiasm than the church has. They weren't meeting online, and they've come back with more enthusiasm. And we've got 2 choirs that practice in the building that seem to have everybody coming back. We've got the youth drop-in, which is kind of part of the church. I won't go into explaining the relationship there, and a creative writing group, but all of which are back in the building now and using the building. We've also started 2 new things since we've gone back in the building, which again have been very well supported. So we've started a chat at the chapel, which is a coffee morning once a fortnight, and where people just come and talk and sit and chat and have coffee and so on. And that was running somewhere else. It was actually running for a time in the pub, which is no longer there, no longer open at the moment. So they've moved to the chapel, but as they've moved to the chapel, they've grown immensely. And it has to be said, we're very much part of it now, and have been able to use this as somewhere where we can talk to people, and it's mainly older people. And we had a harvest supper at the weekend, and almost everybody who goes to chat at the chapel came along to our harvest supper last weekend. We've also, we're now also hosting a hybrid folk group. So we have a hybrid folk group once a month that takes place in the chapel, and people join, again, about 50-50 people in the chapel and people joining. So, and it's almost exactly the same setup as we use for church on Sunday. So that's quite interesting in terms of seeing people come in. We've got some work to do on trying to improve the displays in the vestibule area, and we're gathering photos from all the things and so on, because clearly that kind of new footfall presents an opportunity in how do we communicate the message powerfully in terms of people coming into the building. So that's where we are after lockdown. So I think we're committed to being, hybrid for the foreseeable future, really. And it's hard to see when the time would be right to stop being online as well as in the building. And that's going to have to be the way we all think. So moving on to Barry's questions, is it possible to be a covenanted member online? The membership covenant we have in a bit different from when Barry was there. The principle is the same. I'm signing this covenant because I want to be part of the worship life of the Yelvertoft Independent Chapel, to treat attending Sunday services as a priority in my life, and to encourage others in a life of faith in Jesus Christ. I understand that my entitlement to vote in monthly church meetings is dependent on my continued regular involvement in the worship life of the church. Now, at the moment, Sunday services being at the centre is still true for us. Mark's saying something different in terms of the key worship thing is definitely on Sunday. We talked about this. We definitely regard people attending online as part of people attending the service, and we decided that we were quite happy to have new online people from anywhere in the world as members if they wanted to be. So for us, the answer to that question is definitely yes. I'll move to the next. Much the same as Mark says. I think it's important to remember. Oh yes, one other thing I was going to say about having people not there is when Paul was in prison, I think he was still part of the early church, one in person. So there's been precedent long before we had communication as good as we have for people to be part using whatever communication mechanism they could of what God was doing. So just a thought that I had as we were talking about this. So it strikes me that when we take communion, one of the things we do, I'm not saying this is the whole purpose of communion, of course, when we remember being part of a global body of Christ. By definition, our communion service is a distributed meeting of the church with meetings happening, that global communion service happening in lots of churches all over the world, and we commemorate being together as one. We're one with the people who aren't in the same communion service as well as in the people who are in the same communion service. So same sort of points. Do our elements have to be consecrated by someone special for communion to be valid? I can't begin to explain why Church of England ones have to be concentrated for communion to be valid. I understand why the Catholics do, but I can never get my head around why this is important to the Church of England, but I don't think it's important to most Congregationalists. So can communion be valid with one other person on a hospital or home visit? We do communion in lots of different places, and we'll find they need it. And if the answers to the above are no and yes, I'd just ask what would be the answer to online. So I'll leave it there in terms of the conclusion. How valid is an online church meeting? Well, I know from my experience before I retired that major businesses commonly run with online meetings and run the whole business that way. And it takes a different type of organization. What I would say is that for that to work, effort needed is needed to build relationships outside of those meetings, you know. So actually a church that only meets online, people have to think about how you're going to develop other relationships, because what doesn't tend to happen in quite the same way is when you're all sat in a building together, then there can be 10 different sets of conversations between 3 people that flux and mix, yeah. And people have to kind of think, how are we going to develop those same sort of relationships and keep that chat going? And that's very much up to people to make an effort to talk to people and extend their relationships outside of meeting online. But I believe church meetings can be run online. Same as Mark said, we're having the assembly online, we've been running council online. But big meetings are definitely more difficult to have substantive discussions online than they are with face-to-face meetings. I mean, you know, we were saying about the challenges of dealing with difficult things in council, and I think that we have to consider breakout rooms, people breaking into smaller groups quicker than you would have to with a big group. You've got to think very carefully about how to do it. But in principle, I would, you know, we've chosen to keep our church meetings completely online rather than be hybrid. Everyone said, oh, we don't want to come to the building just to have a church meeting. Let's all do them online, especially winter evenings when coming out in the cold doesn't seem appealing. So pretty much, Barry, those are my thoughts on the topic. I don't know whether that's helpful.
Yeah, I think both of you have been very, very helpful.